Hello, everybody. Today we have a man with us who needs no introduction. He is a face quite popular on the ESG scene and otherwise as well. Hello, Mr. Mukund Rajan. He's the chairperson of ECube Advisory, and welcome to BW Businessworld.
Thank you, Urvi. Thanks for having me.
Likewise, thank you for making time for us. I know we are heading back to work now after a long weekend, but you are here with us to share your inputs on the ESG framework in the country today. So I would like to thank again for your time on this very busy weekday morning.
Most welcome.
Right, so let's just begin with the series of questions we have here. Let's talk about your journey first. So you have been a proponent of ESG from the very beginning of your career, from your initial days in the Tata Group to now as a founder of your own company. Of course, ESG now has become a very popular phrase, and people are realizing its importance, especially since the last 2 years, since the pandemic has hit us. So what drove you towards this field when it was not such a buzzword to begin with?
I guess fate has a hand in the way some of our careers develop. So in my case, it actually goes all the way back to my master's and doctoral dissertations at Oxford University. I went to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship after I finished my engineering program at IIT Delhi. And I was searching for a subject that I could research in politics, but that was still somehow connected to my engineering experience. And the field that I, in some ways, stumbled upon was the field of environmental politics. And so going back to the late 80s, early 90s, I started looking at subjects like global environmental issues. I looked at the politics of ozone depletion, the politics of climate change, the politics of biodiversity loss, the politics of tropical deforestation. And these issues threw up questions around equity, questions around good governance between nations, the need for international collaboration to resolve these issues. And so it was in the early 90s that I produced my first major document on global environmental politics. It was a book published by Oxford University Press. And my interest in that field sustained over the next 2.5 decades. And many years later, when in Tata's, I became chairman of the Tata Global Sustainability Council, many of these same issues came back into center stage and were dominating a lot of the discourse. Just to give you an example, in 2015-16, Norges Bank, which is managing the Norwegian sovereign wealth, decided overnight to decarbonize their portfolio. And one of the companies they withdrew investments from was Tata Power, the Tata Group company, which at that time was very strong on thermal power, coal-fired thermal power. And we saw the impact of investors who are now beginning to take climate, environmental, and ESG issues much more seriously in terms of withdrawal of investments. And obviously that precipitated significant new actions in the Tata Group. And then fast forward to 2018-19, when I set up ECube with some colleagues from the Tata system, we felt that the concerns around corporate governance in India, concerns around climate change, we're going to significantly enhance the conversation on ESG. And that's the reason we set up ESG. So when I look back on my career, I think the book that I wrote based on my doctoral dissertation at Oxford in the early 1990s, subsequent experience in the Tata Group managing the sustainability portfolio, and more recently the work that we've done at ECube, all have sort of combined to create a strong sense of what is now changing in India. And as I rightly said, in the last 2 years, ESG, in fact, has become a buzzword in this country.
Right. So we now see a lot of companies taking steps to better their ESG strategies. But one of the key ways we learn is by making mistakes, which is also true for large corporates. So what are companies getting wrong now while formulating their ESG strategy? What are the key loopholes that are present even today?
I think we are on the very early stages of the ESG journey in this country. I think many companies just beginning to get their arms around it. I think a common misconception, which thankfully now is beginning to change quite substantially, but still exists in some pockets, used to be that ESG is the same as CSR. And the fact is that CSR is only a subset of ESG. It addresses some of the elements under the social or S domain in ESG. But ESG is certainly not equal to CSR. It is much, much more than CSR. That's the first common misconception you find in Indian industry. The second is that ESG is such a vast domain. It could potentially encompass everything to do with the business, ranging from the environmental impact, the social impact, good corporate governance. It's such a vast area. Where do we even begin to address some of these ESG issues? And there, I think the response, certainly from my side, would be don't get worried, don't panic about the fact that ESG is a very large domain. Focus on this concept of materiality. So look at which are the material issues which impact your business from the indicators across E, S, and G. And quite often, when you really drill down, you will find that there are relatively few material issues that can impact a business in a very substantial way to start with. So I would urge companies to focus on those handful, could even be just as little as half a dozen indicators of materiality that you should focus on that are going to be key success drivers in ESG, and then start looking at the broader ESG agenda. The last point I'll make is, again, relating to the second point about where do you start. I think the best companies have typically fixed the governance, not just the typical corporate governance in the sense that the Securities and Exchange Board of India, SEBI, would mandate for listed companies, but also the governance of E and S. So who in the board is discussing these issues and keeping a watch on the company's ESG performance, the execution of its strategy? Who in the management is responsible for this? And how frequently do you review your performance and the progress that the company is making? And I think if you can address the governance question, a lot else then very quickly falls into place. So that would be typically my advice to companies that see the ESG issue as something new, and then initially the sense is it's very daunting. Where do we get started?
Okay, so since we're talking about companies, what kind of role do stakeholders play when we talk about holding companies accountable in their ESG domain?
So stakeholders are from every direction, right? The most obvious stakeholders are those within the company, the employees themselves. And I think companies now realize that you have to carry your employees with you. Your employees are your best brand ambassadors. If they don't buy into what the company stands for, its corporate purpose, its values, and its ESG performance, it's very hard to then get your external stakeholders to be supportive and to be with you on that journey. Next, we see customers playing a very important role in shaping the destinies of companies. Customers are now becoming increasingly aware of ESG issues and are demanding performance from companies. So when a large multinational corporation like Unilever, for instance, has announced that all its 70,000 odd consumer products will start carrying labels which will show the carbon footprint required in delivering them to customer shelves, it shows you how seriously that company is taking this issue, and the fact that it feels many of its customers want this information before they decide to make a purchase decision. So I think customers are becoming very important stakeholders in driving the performance of companies in ESG. And then, of course, you have the usual stakeholders who impact every business, right? You have the regulators, government, which come out with policies which can shape the future of various industries. Increasingly, investors in the public markets, private equity investors, and lenders, the banks, are all playing a very important role because they're also seeing the concerns around ESG risks, and they want to make sure that companies that they're backing through equity or debt are taking these risks seriously and have risk mitigation plans in place. So I think a number of stakeholders are now pushing the agenda and ensuring that companies are incentivized to put the best foot forward on their ESG agendas.
Okay, so moving across a different tangent, you have also authored a book called Outlast, and I have had the good fortune of coming across and reading it. And at an individual level, I can say that was quite insightful. We don't realize how interrelated the ESG is to other aspects of a company or even an individual's life for that matter. So how did you come across writing this book, and what's the importance of having such a book at this stage in India's ESG journey?
So, as I mentioned, I set up this firm along with some colleagues from the Tata system called ECube. And as the name suggests, it's drawn from three E's: engage and empower for ESG. So one was already doing a lot of work in this domain. And then, of course, COVID hit us. And COVID was one very significant example of nature, in a sense, striking back and revolting at the kind of human impact on the environment. And so when one was at home during the lockdown, one was thinking about, how swiftly this agenda is changing all around us. And I thought it was important, along with my co-author, Colonel Dr. Rajiv Kumar, who was another Tata colleague of mine. I thought it was important at this stage to be able to explain to the markets, to companies, to businesses, and to business owners how swiftly everything was changing around us. The world we are in today is very different from even a few years back. And I think the point we discussed just now about stakeholders are now much better informed. They have better science at their disposal, better understanding of how important the ESG agenda is becoming. And so I thought it was timely to be able to communicate this to the broader market and try and explain the trends that are now shaping the good fortunes of businesses going forward. The other important element I felt, and which we explain in the book, is that very similar to the changes that India saw in the early 1990s, when you had the liberalization economic reforms program, and many Indian companies that were not prepared to address the changes that are beginning to happen in India at that time, including the onslaught of multinational corporations, new technologies coming into the Indian market from overseas, different supply chain considerations, the ability of foreign companies to be much better financed when taking on domestic competition. All of those issues saw a number of Indian companies actually vanishing from the landscape. And I felt that this new trend we are seeing now, with the focus on ESG, with the concerns around issues like climate change, is going to see a similar impact on corporate India. And many companies, particularly some of the mid-market companies and smaller companies, which haven't fully understood or appreciated the consequences of the ESG-linked changes we are seeing, will potentially pay a very heavy price and actually exit the market. So in some senses, what we are seeing today and going forward is very similar to the kind of situation that corporate India faced in the early 1990s. It is as dramatic as that. And the reason we came up with the title Outlast is we said that companies that want to see sustainable, profitable growth into the long term, and therefore can potentially outlast their competition, need to appreciate how quickly the ESG agenda is now changing the terms on which you can actually do business in this country and indeed anywhere in the world. So that's the context to why we brought out the book.
That's quite a thoughtful title. I mean, when we talk about ESG, one would expect something very obvious like environment and social and governance, something around those topics. But Outlast kind of summarizes the whole sentiment in one word. So that's quite insightful to learn how the book came about and the title came about. So since we're talking about companies and India's ESG journey overall, what lies ahead? So this will be my final question before we wind off our discussion for today. I wanted to ask you what is going to lie ahead for India in the ESG domain? Where are we in our ESG journey, and what will be the immediate and even long-term future impact of these new verticals, I would say, on the Indian market in general?
So if you look at our current situation as a country on each of the E, S, and G parameters, and obviously we've explained this in much more detail in the book, but I think you can see it as quite a dismal situation currently. There's huge scope for improvement. So if you take environmental indicators, air pollution, for instance, India today accounts for maybe 20 plus of the 30 most polluted cities in the world. If you look at issues around the social indicators, whether it's our treatment of women The Prime Minister yesterday in his Independence Day speech also talked about the importance of gender equity, or even if you look at equity in terms of the way we treat our scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, their representation in the levers of power, it is quite dismal. Similarly, if you look at governance, the number of poor corporate governance cases we have in India, the number of very big brands, think about financial services, think about airlines that have gone bust because of poor corporate governance, the number of promoters, many of them now in jail for malpractices, all reflects poor corporate governance by and large, and also accounts for a large part of the non-performing assets in the Indian banking system, which in turn is a significant explanation for India's economic slowdown in recent years. So I think ESG in that sense, we are at a particularly bad point of time just now. But there is huge scope for improvement. And the good news is that on each of these indicators, a combination of regulation, better policies for the future, and stakeholder activism is, I think, pushing the agenda and forcing companies to do better. In the corporate world, in the next 1 year alone, the biggest perhaps differentiator will be the fact that the new business responsibility and sustainability reports mandated by the Securities and Exchange Board of India, SEBI for the top 1,000 listed companies, will mean much more data and information will become available to the Indian public markets, but how our companies are actually taking this agenda seriously. And I think there'll be a big drive for improvement as soon as companies find that they're being either named and shamed or there are significant opportunities for improvement vis-a-vis the competition. I think in this decade, the most important driver beyond regulation will be, I think, concerns around climate change. I think the whole world this past few months has seen so many issues around droughts, in some cases floods, unprecedented high temperatures, including in India. I think all this is going to push companies to do better, particularly on the climate agenda. And as you're aware, India has announced at Glasgow last year at COP26, the Conference of Parties on Climate Change, that we're going to adopt much more aggressive stance on addressing climate change, including moving up to potentially half of our energy production through renewables, and 45% improvement in energy efficiency over 2005 levels by 2030. That, I think, will be a very big driver of change in the corporate world through this decade. So I think the signs are positive. I would certainly be optimistic that ESG will push Indian businesses to do far, far better than they've done in the past, on the back of better regulation, better data, better science, and much stronger stakeholder push.
Yes, they say in English that, acknowledging a problem is half the battle won. And the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So I believe we have taken that first step, and the next decade is going to be detrimenting for ESG. So with that positive note, let's close our conversation for today. And thank you so much, Dr. Rajan, for joining us and contributing your thoughts. It's been quite insightful. And we have learned some key data points as well regarding India's ambitions in this direction. Thank you so much for joining us and wish you a lovely day ahead.
Thank you. Real pleasure being with you. Thank you so much.